Deborah, thank you, Sue Ann. Deborah asked, and I wanted to answer for everybody that next Wednesday will be our last discussion for the We Are St. Mark text study of Acts chapter 11. We're going to take November off because there's a lot of prep work we have to do here in the church for the month of December. I'm going to look at the possibility of doing an Advent study, but I'm not making promises at this point, and I will let you know next week. So between now and next Wednesday, I'll try to have that decided and figured out, and we'll let you know as much as I can next week. Okay. All right. So this week we're looking really at verse 26, and I like to kind of think that that's a long verse that probably should have been broken up into a couple of different verses. But it's after Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. He brought him to Antioch. And so it was that for an entire year, they associated with the church and taught a great many people. And this is always the delightful part of this story, right? It was in the Antioch that they were first called Christian. And that brings us to an interesting question, the likes of which was raised by Bill Postma this week in an email to me, and I want to go straight to Bill's question. And really, he's asking more or less, how did the church develop after the resurrection to become this institution as we know it? And you know, it's not easy to answer that question because there's nobody who sat down and said, okay, here's a play-by-play description of how the church developed. If anybody did that, it's the writer of the book of Acts. So this is probably our best attempt from somewhere around that time to account for how the church developed. There are some historical references that you'll see periodically that point to followers of Jesus or something like that. A lot of those historical references are from much later and just kind of retrospective look. Our best resources, as far as I can tell, are two things. The first would be the letters in the New Testament. The letters in the New Testament. And then the second would be the book of Acts. And for some reason, we need to take both of those with a grain of salt, just a grain, okay? And chiefly because they're not historians in the way that we understand historians to be. We expect historians to be disinterested, not uninterested, but like not having skin in the game, so they can give you an objective look. That's what we expect from historians, and we rarely get it, but at least we expect it. That is not how history was written for thousands of years. It was fully invested interest in telling of the story, usually telling in order to justify a certain people's position or something like that. So we're not getting a disinterested historical view. If you look at the letters in the New Testament, probably, I mentioned this last week, probably the earliest New Testament writing is the letter called First Thessalonians. So it's a letter to the church in Thessalonica. And it's usually dated. There's a little guesswork here, but it's built on things. Usually dated around 50-ish, somewhere. And that feels kind of late. But the other letters from Paul seem to follow that. Paul's death is usually put around 63, somewhere around there. And look, I have told you before, and I am going to tell you right now, I am the worst historian this world has ever produced. My history skills are second only to my geographical skills in being notoriously bad. But we're talking a couple of decades after Jesus, but also a couple or more decades before the writings of the Gospels. So when you grow up reading the New Testament and the first book is Matthew, you kind of get it in your head that this was written first and everybody else was written after. But Paul's letters are earlier. And most likely Paul has already been put to death before the Gospels are written. So the first hint we get are Paul's letters. And in Paul's letters, we get some interesting things. There's a lot of contention over who authentically speaks for the church. And in Galatians, in Corinthians, particularly, Paul has to spend a lot of time justifying his apostleship and being, encouraging them to accept him as an apostle, a status which apparently is being challenged by some other folks. In Galatians is the story of where Paul stood up to Peter and, accused him of acting hypocritically, one way around Gentiles when no Jews were around, and another way around Gentiles when there were Jews around. And, that's no small thing to stand up to Peter. We can tell from the Gospels that, at least early on, Peter was recognized as a leader. And Paul says, Peter, James, and John are those who are reputed to be pillars of the church. So in Paul's letters, we're getting a sense that there are those three apostles, Peter, James, and John, who have a certain status. And Paul had a status that was accepted by some people, challenged by others. You could argue that he was an apostle by the calling of God. And in Paul's letter, and I think this is in Romans, in the salutations and at the end, the goodbyes part, he mentions Junius, called an apostle. Junius. That's a feminine form of a name. And that name was masculinized, made into a guy's name, Junius, somewhere along the line. The earliest manuscripts have Junius ending with an AS. Later manuscripts have Junius ending with a US. Goes from the feminine form to the masculine. Because someone thought, surely, you can't be having a woman called an apostle. But there was, early in Paul's letter. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the title apostle, which we normally associate just with the 12, because of the Gospels, and in the Gospels, they are the apostles. In the early church, it was seen as an office to which one could be called by God, not just the hand-picked 12. So there was the office of apostle. There was the office of prophet. There was the office later of deacon. There was the office of elder. And in different letters, in different places, these offices seem to indicate, something specific. We can't just put them all together and say, oh, here's a clear way the church was operating. I think we have to accept two things. One is that the church in different places probably had different iterations. And number two is that when we see these terms in the New Testament, we should always think of them as evolving terms. Evolving terms. They're coming into meaning rather than they have meaning. So when you see it, it means this. It's more like you see it and it's becoming what we now call apostle, elder, pastor, teacher, yada, yada. These are evolving terms, and we're getting glimpses of them in the early evolutionary stages. So it's hard to say this is the way it was. Okay. So you have Paul's letters. You also have 13 letters in the New Testament are attributed to Paul. I'm of the opinion, this is me, along with Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, we're of the opinion that Paul actually wrote 6 of them, and that the other 7 were written later by some of Paul's followers in Paul's name. And that matters a little bit because the nature of the language changes some. If you read Galatians, where in Christ there's neither male nor female, that's a radical vision. Neither slave nor Jew, or Greek nor Jew, slave nor free. That's a radical vision of what it means to be in Christ. And then you get to Ephesians, which I don't think was written by Paul. It says, wives, be submissive to your husband. And you get to 1 Timothy, which nobody really thinks was written by Paul. Says women ought to keep silent in the church. All right, so there, when I say Paul's letters are one of our earliest witnesses of the state of the church, just remember the whole idea of what constitutes a letter from Paul. It is negotiable, arguable concept. Okay, but we also have the Book of Acts, and it's hard to date the Book of Acts. If indeed it was written as a compendium to the Gospel of Luke, then it's probably in the late 80s that it was written, and not as things were unfolding. I have some serious questions about that, but I don't know how even to form those questions in a good way. And one day when I figure out how to do it, I'm going to ask somebody who's a lot smarter than I am about these things, because I'm just confused about it. But let's just take the Book of Acts as we have it. If we use the Book of Acts as a historical glimpse of the development, the evolution of the church, it starts in Jerusalem. That's different from the Gospel of Mark, where they were supposed to go to Galilee. The apostles were supposed to go to Galilee in Mark's Gospel. All right, but in the telling of the Book of Acts, the church starts in Jerusalem. It multiplies in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Right, 3,000 were added to the church. The big number, right? So you have this movement in Jerusalem that multiplies, but also on the day of Pentecost, it becomes a very multicultural Jewish Christian entity, because you have Jews from all over the known world at that time, the ecumene, gathered in Jerusalem for the celebration of Pentecost. That's a Jewish celebration. So now you have the church much larger, still in Jerusalem, and filled with a lot of different ethnic Jews, many of whom one would assume would go home after the great holy days, like the Ethiopian treasurer was heading home from Jerusalem after being there for holy days. So now you've got the spread of the church, still largely Jewish Christian, spreading naturally and the way a church should spread, and spreading by the fervent preaching of and witness of the people who are part of it. In Acts chapter 5, you see how the early Christians and the Jews in Jerusalem are starting to contend with one another. And Peter and John get thrown into prison for a time. And they rejoice that they are able to suffer for the name of Christ. They're told by the Jerusalem council, stop preaching. And they say, we'd rather obey God than human. That's a great line there. In Acts chapter 6, something very significant happens. And that is that the apostles, who are still the head of the church in Jerusalem, discovered that they can't do it all. And they're supposed to be dispensing some of the collected monies to the widows. And the Gentile widows are complaining that the Jewish widows are getting a lot more than they are. And actually, they're not getting a fair share. They're not getting enough. And nobody says they're wrong, but the apostles say, we need a new system. And that's when they elect deacons, 7 deacons, whose job is to oversee that part of the church's ministry. So what do we know now? We still have a Jewish Christian church, still in Jerusalem, still nominally headed by the apostles. One of its functions is to take care of widows and orphans, which is a huge demand and value in the Old Testament. So this is part of their Jewish inheritance. And yet the structure begins to grow because they add this office of deacon. And these deacons are preaching machines. One of them was Stephen, who becomes the first martyr because of the way he proclaimed the gospel. Philip is one, and Philip becomes the evangelist that evangelizes the Ethiopian treasurer. So the fact that they were deacons doesn't mean, the apostles did all the speaking and they just did all the serving. Even a deacon was carrying the message. And then the other thing that we see in the book of Acts, and I'll come back to you, Darryl, is another way the church spread was because of persecution. And that started with Stephen's death. That started with Saul's fervent persecution activities in the book of Acts. And
his halitosis.
His spiritual halitosis, breathing out threats and slaughter. And that's what resulted in people going to Antioch and Jewish Christians fleeing persecution, going to Antioch, speaking the gospel to Jews. But again, a new development there in Antioch, that now the gospel is being spoken to the Hellenists, not just the Jews. So this is all new. And so insofar as the writer of the book of Acts is giving a faithful description, what we're seeing is an interesting evolution, a movement that originally was exclusively in Jerusalem, and then began to spread naturally, and then began to spread unnaturally through persecution and diaspora. And yet the council in Jerusalem still had that kind of original authority, as it were. So when Peter is in Joppa, which is a different place, and he begins speaking to the Gentiles in the centurion's home, when the folks in Antioch began speaking to the Hellenists. It's the church in Jerusalem that sends people or advises what to do. So in some respect, now we're seeing that you've got these local church bodies, kind of like the folks to whom Paul writes letters, but you also have some accountability system, as it were, that still goes back to Jerusalem. And that's probably, that's going to break apart over time by a number of things. One is the destruction of the temple in 70. prior to Rome destroying the temple, there was a revolution from 66 through 70. Lots of people fled Jerusalem during that time. It was a hotbed of violent revolution against the Roman Empire and led by zealous people. And some people joined in because they saw it as a great moment, and some people ran away because they saw it as corruption. So eventually, but we don't really know when, but eventually the church leadership won't be in Jerusalem anymore. But by the end of the book of Acts, it still is, more or less. So Bill, I hope that that's a little bit answering your question. Is that, you can't just say, this is what the church looked like. It's like all we have are photographs of a moving life. And we have to put as many of them together and say, so this seems to be the trajectory. And I think Luke, or whoever wrote Acts, gives us the blueprint in 1:8, when Jesus says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And I think that's what the rest of the book of Acts is telling. Okay, we have several hands up, and I'm going to try to take them in order. Beryl, I think you were first.
Is the word church actually in Acts? They were meeting in synagogues, weren't they?
Yeah. So
I mean, I don't know when that word comes into.
Yeah, and and it's going to be a long time before the word church refers to buildings. But the word, yes, the word church is in Acts, ecclesia, the called out ones. It's a common term. It's not a religious term originally. You could have a called out meeting, like a town hall meeting. You could have a called out annual meeting of the congregation. Anytime people are called out for the purpose of deliberating or hearing or teaching or something like that, that's an ecclesia.
And that's the basis of church?
That's the word that's translated church.
And secondly, are there two Jameses, right? There's James, the brother James and John, and there's also James, the brother, still later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's in Acts chapter 12 that begins ingloriously. About that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John.
Brother of John.
Yeah. Killed. And then in Acts chapter 15, when you have the council at Jerusalem, this is really an interesting thing. They're trying to decide what to do about all these Gentiles, right? And whether this is the proper expression for the church and so forth. And Peter stands up and tells him about his experience with Cornelius. Barnabas and Paul tell about the signs and wonders God has done with them. And verse 13 tells us something else about the structure of the church that takes us by surprise. It doesn't introduce it, but it just happens. It says, after they finished speaking, James, the brother of John, James replied, my brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God, Simeon and Simon, called Peter, how God looked favorably on the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. This agrees with the words of the prophet as it is written, and he quotes the prophet. And then in verse 19, therefore, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, from fornication, for whatever has been strangled and in blood. I have reached a decision. And they all were like, okay, the decision has been reached. Now, that's got to really trouble your Roman Catholic friends, for whom Simon Peter was the first pope. Because somehow James has this authority. And when they all are, I mean, all the players are here. Barnabas and Paul and Peter and James says, I've reached this decision. And the decision is reached. Nobody has to second the motion. Nobody has to argue about it and vote on it. So that's another thing we've discovered about the church, is that in some form, at least according to the writer of Acts, James had the final voice when it came to these matters. And nobody seems to argue. So that's not always going to square with what you think, right? If you read the Gospel of Matthew, you would think that Simon Peter is going to be in charge. Jesus looked at Peter and said, you are Simon, I call you Peter, the rock. You're the rock on which I will build my church. I give you the keys to the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Says it, Simon Peter. Not in Acts, James in charge. Mic drop. Okay. I'm sure there are 1,000 things left unsaid, but I think Les had his hand up second. Les. If the moment's lost, we can pray for it to come back.
Yeah, I'm trying to grasp how this integration really took place.
Of Jews and Gentiles?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, not without a lot of struggle. Right? Not without a lot of struggle.
I served a church in Koreatown that had very few Koreans, but we had 15 national flags represented there.
Yeah.
And those flags would pop up at unexpected times.
Yeah.
And we were expected to somehow deal with them and integrate them into the ongoing life of that particular congregation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, it's the theological struggle. There are two theological struggles in the New Testament. One is, how is it that we have Jews and Gentiles? How can you be a faithful Jew and accept Gentiles who are brought into this church? The other struggle is, why didn't Jesus come back already, like we thought he would? That's a very, very difficult struggle for the New Testament church. And here we are 2,000 years later, ignoring it. Okay, Jerry, you had your.
We speak about Gentiles all the time, and I just sort of wonder, who are they? In a way, we think, well, they're Greeks, but there weren't that many Greeks. And what has been lost to me are Abraham's children who weren't Jewish, those other Semites. And were they a large population in this area that would have been accepted in? How would a Jew feel about a Semite becoming a Christian?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't. There don't seem to be a lot of stories about running across the children of Esau.
Yeah.
Right. Ishmael. That doesn't seem to be the issue. The closest, perhaps, we get to that. I've never been terribly clear what the sectarian difference was between Jews and Samaritans. They certainly all worship the God of Abraham.
We're purer than you.
Yeah, well, in the book of in the Gospels, Samaria, just going through Samaria, or Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman, this is a big, big deal. In the book of Acts, Philip goes and preaches in Samaria, and everybody's like, good. I mean, there's none of that. So I think there is a different quality of relationship. The book of Acts talks about Hellenists, and I mentioned a couple weeks ago, we're not always sure how to translate that. Is it just people who speak Greek, or is it people who serve Greek divinities? It's kind of hard to say. Outside of Jerusalem, maybe that's what the Jews who were part of earlier diasporas struggled with more than just Gentiles per se, but Greek culture. That certainly was a big deal during the intertestamental writing. So anyway, I don't know, Jerry. And what's interesting is I think we just have to be satisfied that we get time constrained glimpses of what was going on. And we have to kind of tease out from that maybe a connected narrative. But we don't, no one's deliberately answering our questions in the way that we like our questions answered. And so we have to just kind of look for real evidence. Let's make it fast because we haven't even got an outline.
Would not, Jerry's question, all the other Semites ipso facto fall into categories of Gentiles?
Well, maybe, or they might, the other Semites might fall into the category of Jew. You gotta remember who's writing this story. To the Romans, there was no difference between a Jew and a Samaritan. I mean, you know, they're little sectarian arguments. Nobody cares, right? They're just all these people. They serve the God called Yahweh. That was enough for the Romans. Whoever's writing Acts doesn't appear to be Jewish. And as such, may not know the difference between the different Semitic. I mean, I don't mean to sound crass, but these folks in Jerusalem, okay, you got that. But what the writer of Acts recognizes and puts it in the mouth of who is it? I think we'll see it in a minute. Puts it in the mouth, I think maybe of Paul. That throughout the years, Jews have been found throughout the world. I mean, just recognizes that historically, you've got Jewish establishment all throughout the world. It's never just been Jews. That's why the holy days were such a big deal, is people would make those trips, those treks, those pilgrimages, as it were, to Jerusalem. So already written into the life of Judaism, if we can use that as an altogether term, are differences, cultural differences, differences in practices and all that. But they look to Jerusalem as the center and the state of it. So the early church will reflect that for a time. By the 4th century, it will reflect the Roman Empire, where everybody has their distinctive flavor, but you look to Rome as the authoritative seat where God's word is, at least for the Western church. Eastern Orthodox Church will argue that it's a very different animal. So early Christian practice was diversified, but looked to Jerusalem, which I would argue probably was a state of Judaism at that time as well. Not all Jews lived in Jerusalem or even Judea. Okay, I do have an outline, and I'd like to honor it for a minute and look at it for just a moment. Bill, I do want to thank you for that question, because we're looking at a book that looks like a historical book, and it is in its own way, but it's not historical in our way. So it's a good question to raise, and I appreciate it. I wanted you to be aware that when it says Paul and Barnabas associated with the church, that's really an interesting verb, and that the actual Greek verb there is the word synagogue, which is the verbal form of the word that as a noun becomes synagogue, and it just means to gather together. But the NRSV, and I know this is true of the online version. I haven't checked to see if this is true of the printed version. I hope so. So let's look at Act chapter 11, verse 26, and see if they help us here. Yes, they do. It says, for an entire year, they met with, so the New Revised Standard Version in England and the New Revised Standard Version in the United States are a little different. I read the Anglicized version online because it's the best one to use. The one we have here says they met with, the Anglicized version says they associated with, but there's a footnote there. You see that? And a footnote, the footnotes are so tiny. D. And one thing is, instead of saying they associated or met with them, they were guests.
Yes.
Yeah, which I think is probably what do I know? But I think it's a better translation because the verb is passive. It's not what they did, it's what they had done. So I think I think guest is a really, really strong interpretation there, which says another thing about the church in Antioch.
Did not throw them out.
They didn't throw Saul out. If they wanted to throw anybody out, it would be Saul. He's the guy, he killed the cousin, right? They have every reason to hate this guy. And Saul comes and is a guest of the church for an entire year and teaching. I just find that to be a phenomenal thing. I don't want you to overlook it. He wasn't Paul, the great apostle at this point. He's still, at times it takes your reputation a little lag time to catch up with your transformation. And they still know him as Paul the killer, Paul the terror. And yet they invite him for a year. He's their guest for a year. I think that's an amazing statement. It says they taught a great many people, and I wanted you to pay attention to Acts chapter 1, verse 1, the way this book starts. The former treatise have I written, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. So the teaching aspect of Jesus and the teaching aspect of the church is a continuation of the ministry of Jesus. And it's a central part of the church's job is to teach. I think this is an inheritance they got from Judaism. And I think it's a lovely inheritance. So there's preaching, there's teaching, there's healing, there's serving, all the things that could be under that word to do. But there's also teaching. There's teaching. That's a mark of the church, I would say, especially in the book of Acts. And then I want you to look at verses 33, at chapter 15, verses 33 through 35 for just a minute. This is after the Jerusalem Council. Okay, so they've met to talk about what do we do with Gentiles. James reached the decision that we should welcome them. He does say there are 4 things they shouldn't do, right? They shouldn't eat foods offered idols, things strangled. They shouldn't eat blood. They should stop fornicating. All right. All good advice. All right. And then they write a letter to the churches that are now dealing with the Gentile question. And they send the letter with Paul and Barnabas. And so let's start at verse 22. Then the apostles and the elders, with the consent of the whole church, decided to choose men from among their members and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They sent Judas, called Barsabas, and Silas, leaders among the brothers, with the following letter, yada, yada, yada. And so they communicate what they have said. Then slip down to verse 30. So they went off and went down to Antioch. When they gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. All right, so this is our Antioch church here, right? They're getting this letter. And when its members read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen believers. Verse 33, after they had been there for some time, they were sent off in peace by the believers to those who had sent them. This is Judas and Silas. Verse 34. There is no verse 34.
Yeah, that's funny, yeah.
What in the world happened to verse 34?
Disappeared.
Verse 34 was added in some of the later manuscripts. It's not present in the earlier manuscripts. Verse 34 read, it seemed good to Silas to remain with them. Why would anybody add that? Because at the end of this chapter, Paul and Silas are going to go one way. Barnabas is going to go another way with John Mark, because Barnabas and Paul split up. It's almost as sad as when the Beatles split up. So somebody very helpfully is saying, well, we can't send Silas back to Jerusalem. Let's have him stay. And they added a verse. Okay. This is the maddening part about reading the scriptures. Is it was passed from hand to hand. And we have to hope that it was done well. And there are moments when it obviously was not done well. And your translators are doing you a solid here by saying, that verse doesn't really belong there. We'll stick it down in this footnote, because who reads the footnotes, right? You've never noticed that verse 34 wasn't there, have you? Then suddenly, boom, it's not there. And now we know why, okay? And then verse 35, Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch. So this is the second time. And there with many others, they taught and proclaimed the word of God. This is their role. The word translated proclaimed is the word euangelion, evangelize, that I talked about during my sermon last Sunday. They good newsed them, and they taught them. So I think it raises an interesting question of what it means to be part of a church where teaching is a central practice. Because at least as it's described in the book of Acts, teaching is at the heart of the church. My late friend Gus Nelson engineered some studies on adult education in the church. And less than 10% of the adults in a church engage in some sort of Bible or theological study throughout the church year. So consider yourselves part of the 10%, less than 10%. I just don't know that it's a value for a lot of people. And the reason I keep stepping on these verses in front of you is to show that it certainly seemed to be a value for the early church, that teaching is not a small thing. Okay, so let me get to the last thing. We've got like 15 minutes left. I'm so sorry because I have spent so much time not talking about this. We're thinking about the word Christian. They're first called Christian. And you heard me mention both in the video, and you heard Deborah and Shelley say in our worship services this past weekend, there are 3 occasions that the word Christian appears in the New Testament. And the first is in the letter 1 Peter chapter 4. And in that letter, it's associated with the suffering of Christ. Another time is in Acts chapter 26, when King Herod Agrippa II asked Paul, in such a short time, you want me to become a Christian? And we can't tell if that's a snarky question or a genuine one. And the other time is here. in chapter 11. They're first called Christians in Antioch. Yes.
Well, in response to your question, I think, yes, that is a snarky question, because somewhere I understood term Christian not to be a term of approbation, but a negative term used by those in Antioch, not necessarily followers of the way. Oh, look at those Christians, little price.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it means little.
Well, it's a
Um,
diminutive term.
I don't think it's negative. I think that's an interpretation. Were they called Christians as a compliment because they were Christ-like? Were they called Christians as a derisive term? I don't think you can answer that question by the word itself. I think that's a judgment call we have to make about how we think it's being used in Antioch, how we think it's being used by King Agrippa. If you read Paul's response to Agrippa, he doesn't seem to take offense. Of course, he's talking to a king, so maybe he can't take offense. And it's hard to say in Antioch whether that's a derisive term or an honorable one. It just says they were first called Christians in Antioch. And exegeting the word Christian is not going to answer this question for us. So it's a judgment call that we have to make. So we'll take that it could have been derisive. It could have been admirable. What we don't know. We don't. It's just a statement there at the end of that part of the story. I think we look at the context. The church in Antioch was begun by people fleeing persecution, and that they are Christ-like is how I hear the word Christian, in that they were sufferers. There are other ways to look at that. That's not the most popular way of referring to followers of Jesus. Actually, in the book of Acts, the most popular way is to call it the way. The way. So some of you might remember, and I don't know if we have one here, you might remember a paperback translation of the Bible that came out in the 70s that was really groovy, and it was called The Way. Look it up sometime. You'll recognize it. It was in all of the youth rooms at great churches throughout the world. And why was it called The Way, right? It wasn't a reference to John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It wasn't a reference to that. I mean, it might have been in some people's minds. But that was probably the original way of referring to followers of Jesus. And you see it in Acts chapter 9. This is a story of Saul's experience on the road to Damascus. And listen how it opens. This is the spiritual halitosis verse. Yet Saul, still breathing out threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, in this translation, and I think this is a strong judgment, they capitalize the word way to say, look, this is the thing. Because it's a common word for way. I mean, along the way, so-and-so, that would be the right word. Over. And yet they capitalize it because they're signifying for us, pay attention to this word, to this phrase. It's how the church is identified. If you look in chapter 22, this is when Paul is defending himself in front of the governor Felix. And in verses 3 and 4, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, so he's in Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them into prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. This way, again, the NRSV translators decided to capitalize that. And I think rightly. This was a title.
Where is that again?
That's in chapter 22.
22.
Yeah, verses 3 and 4. And then in chapter 24. Okay, in chapter 22, I forget who he's talking in front of. I think he's talking in front of the council. In chapter 24, he's talking in front of Felix, who was the governor in Caesarea. And in verse 14, one more time, he says, but this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect. Now, who is they? They, he's talking about his Jewish accusers. So it says, according to the way which my accusers call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law and or written in the prophets. So he's identifying, yes, there is this distinctive movement, which they are calling a sect. And he doesn't argue that, but his point is that it's not disconnected to Judaism. He is a faithful Jew by following the way. And I think that was the theological disposition of early Jewish Christians, is not that they were joining a new denomination, but that they would be faithful to all that's taught in the law and the prophets by following the way, and the way being the teachings of Jesus, which others call a sect. So again, just a glimpse into kind of some of the early dynamics, political power dynamics of the early church. But 3 times that phrase, the way, comes up. There are a couple of other times that the word comes up, and I think they're a little more ambiguous. So for example, in chapter 16, there's a great story about how Paul and Barnabas, let's see who this really is. Paul and Silas. This is during their missionary journey. Starting in verse 16, chapter 16, verse 16. One day, as we were going up to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." Now, it's got an indefinite article there because there's no definite article. And the trick in Greek is, if there's a definite article, you say the something. If there's not one, you typically say a something when you're translating. She refers to a way of salvation. But she also recognizes that it's part of the Most High God, not the Roman God, not the Greek God, not the pantheon, but the kind of God that Jews talk about. She might be using the same term. It's certainly the same word, whether she's using it officially as a thing or not, a little ambiguous. In chapter 18, the same thing happens in verses 25 and 26. It says, talking about how someone named Apollos came. He was an eloquent man, well-versed in the scriptures. He had been instructing in the way of the Lord. The word way is capitalized there. And he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, although he only knew the baptism of John. when he began speaking boldly in the synagogue, But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. So twice in those couple of verses, you've got the word way capitalized. And what we're getting is that there's more to it than what Apollos knew. But because it's capitalized, the translators are telling us they think this is speaking of that movement, which some people call a sect. And again, I think the early Christians before the word Christian caught on were called people of the way. And that's why in Van Nuys, California, Dr. Jack Hayford started a church called the Church of the Way. And
Well, it's also noteworthy that it's women who are doing the instructing.
At least one of them, Priscilla and Aquila, or a couple. That's right. Some people think Priscilla might have written the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews. Because she was a teacher in the early church. It's a stretch, but one that I like. So anyway, okay. So I guess I just wanted you to see that while we can't say with a whole lot of dogmatic clarity, here's how the church was, who was in charge, here are the offices, here's when this happened, here's where that happened. What we can see glimpses, and when we look at those glimpses and string them together, you get a sense that you have a movement started in Jerusalem, mostly Jewish Christians, that began to spread organically, but then also spread inorganically by way of persecution. And along the way began to stretch out of being Jewish Christians to including Hellenist or Gentile Christians, and was vaguely referred to as the Way, and later became associated with the name of the Christ itself. And that may be the best we can get. It's just to see that that's roughly how this was happening. And then I would just invite you then, when you go back and you read Romans and Galatians and Philippians and First Thessalonians and First and Second Corinthians, that you're probably looking at the earliest letters that Paul wrote to the churches. And you can see the development of some offices. Every local church had somebody that seemed to be kind of the gatherer, as it were. And you can start to see the evolution of the church there as well. Okay. It is 10:30, and that's all we're going to have time for today. I hope I didn't leave too many questions on the table. I don't see any in the chat. But thank you all who joined us online, and thank you all. We'll meet one more time next week, and next week I'll talk about our plans for Advent. Okay.